The hull was burning before she even crossed back into friendly airspace. Black smoke poured from the starboard engine nacelle of the A-10 Thunderbolt II, trailing behind the aircraft like a funeral shroud against the pre-dawn sky over Helmand Province. The radio had been silent for 47 minutes. No mayday, no status update, just the last transmission anyone heard from her. Phantom 2-1, engaging. Then nothing. On the ground, 12 Navy SEALs crouched in a dried riverbed, surrounded by 200 Taliban fighters closing in from three sides. They had called for close air support 39 minutes earlier. They had been told a warthog was inbound. They had heard the distinctive sound of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon tearing through the morning air, that deep, guttural BRRRT that made the earth itself seem to shudder. Then silence. The kind of silence that makes operators check their weapons and count their remaining magazines. The kind that makes men who never pray start bargaining with God. The SEAL team leader, a master chief with 17 years in naval special warfare, keyed his radio twice. No response. He tried again. Nothing. Above them, somewhere in that smoke-stained sky, Lieutenant Commander Sloan Devereaux was fighting two wars simultaneously. One against the aircraft that was actively trying to kill her. One against the voice in her head that sounded exactly like her father. The A-10 had taken a Chinese-made FN-6 MANPADS missile directly into the right engine 3 minutes after her fourth gun run. The explosion had been catastrophic. Hydraulic fluid was hemorrhaging from severed lines. The right aileron was barely responding. Engine fire warnings screamed in her headset. Every instrument on the right side of her cockpit was either dead or lying. The flight manual, the one she had memorized during her first squadron assignment 8 years ago, said she should eject, that she should pull the handles, separate from the jet, and let the titanium bathtub that surrounded the A-10's cockpit do its job. That was the smart play, the survivable play, the play her father, a retired Air Force colonel who had flown F-15s over Iraq, would have demanded she make. But 12 men were going to die in the next 6 minutes if she left. The Taliban fighters were less than 400 meters from the SEAL position. Sloan could see them on her targeting pod, moving through the sparse vegetation like wolves circling wounded prey. She could see the muzzle flashes. She could see the SEALs returning fire, their position becoming more compressed with each passing second. She could see exactly what was about to happen, what always happened when air support left too early. Her right hand, steady despite the violent shaking of the damaged airframe, moved to the weapons panel. She had 480 rounds remaining in the GAU-8, enough for maybe 2 more gun runs if she controlled the trigger discipline. The targeting pipper on her heads-up display danced across her canopy as she fought to keep the aircraft stable with her left hand on the stick. The A-10 wanted to roll right, wanted to spiral into the desert floor 2,000 feet below. The hydraulic pressure gauge was dropping toward zero. In 90 seconds, she would lose all flight control authority. The aircraft would become a 9-ton lawn dart with her name stenciled on the side. Sloane's call sign was Revenant. Most people in her squadron assumed it was because she was quiet, almost ghostly in how she moved through the ready room. A few knew the real reason. 7 years earlier, during her first combat deployment, she had been the wingman on a close air support mission over Kandahar. Her flight lead had taken ground fire and ejected. She had stayed on station for 43 minutes past her bingo fuel, the point where she should have returned to base, coordinating the rescue while engaging enemy positions. She had landed with less than 800 pounds of fuel remaining, enough for maybe 4 more minutes of flight time. Her squadron commander had chewed her out for 30 minutes, then quietly put her in for a Distinguished Flying Cross. The nickname stuck. The ghost who wouldn't leave. The pilot who came back. Now, over-helmed, with one engine on fire and her right wing slowly disintegrating, Revenant was about to earn that call sign all over again. She nosed the A-10 into a 30-degree dive, lining up on the northern cluster of Taliban fighters. The airspeed indicator climbed through 300 knots, too fast for a gun run under normal circumstances. But circumstances stopped being normal the moment that missile had found her engine. The GAU-8 was mounted slightly to the left of the aircraft's center line. When it fired, the entire jet shuddered like a living thing. Sloane had always thought of it as the A-10's heartbeat, that brief, violent rhythm that meant something on the ground was about to cease existing. She pressed the trigger. The cannon roared, 47 rounds in a 2-second burst. The 30 depleted uranium rounds impacted the desert floor at 3,900 feet per second, each projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to penetrate 5 inches of steel armor. The Taliban fighters weren't wearing steel armor. They simply ceased to be. Through her targeting pod, Sloane watched the northern position evaporate in a cloud of dust and fire. The SEALs immediately shifted their fire to the eastern flank. They knew what that sound meant. Someone was still fighting for them. But the cost of that gun run was severe. The dive had exacerbated the engine fire. Flames were now visibly trailing from the right nacelle, bright orange against the lightening sky. The master caution panel looked like a Christmas tree. Fire warnings, hydraulic failures, flight control degradation. The list of things trying to kill her was growing by the second. Sloane pulled the A-10 into a hard left turn, the G-forces pressing her into her ejection seat. The aircraft groaned in protest. Metal screamed against metal somewhere behind her, but she stayed airborne, still flying, still fighting. She keyed her radio. Her voice, when it came, was calm, almost conversational. Phantom 2-1 still on station. Continue to mark targets. On the ground, the SEAL team leader stared at his radio like it had just spoken in tongues. She was still up there. Still flying, still engaging. He had seen A-10s take damage before. Everyone who worked in special operations had stories about warthogs limping home with entire sections of wing missing or engines shot out. But he had never heard of a pilot continuing to engage after taking a MANPADS hit. That was supposed to be a death sentence. He keyed his mic. "Revenant, Phantom 2-1, you need to RTB. We can hold." It was a lie. They both knew it. The Taliban had them bracketed. Without continuous air support, the SEALs would be overrun in less than 5 minutes. There were too many enemy fighters, too little ammunition, and zero cover. Sloan's response came back immediate. "Negative, Phantom. I've got 300 rounds and a grudge, marking your eastern flank now." She rolled the A-10 into another attack run, this time targeting the fighters approaching from the east. The A-10 was never designed to be graceful. It was designed to be unkillable. Sloan had always appreciated that about the jet. No fancy aesthetics, no sleek lines or supersonic performance, just titanium, redundancy, and a gun that could delete grid squares. She had fallen in love with the Warthog during her first flight in the aircraft, back when half her squadron still thought women didn't belong in combat roles, and the other half was waiting for her to fail. They had stopped waiting after her third deployment. Now, with her right engine consumed by fire and hydraulic fluid coating her canopy, she was proving why the A-10 had earned its reputation. The jet absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other aircraft. It kept flying through damage that should have been catastrophic. It brought its pilots home when every system said they should be dead. Sloan lined up her third gun run, targeting the eastern position. 273 rounds remaining. The Taliban fighters were less than 300 meters from the SEAL position now, close enough that she could see individual figures through her targeting pod, close enough that her margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. If she missed, if the rounds landed even 20 meters off target, she would hit friendly forces. She steadied her breathing, waited for the targeting pipper to settle, pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared again. 53 rounds downrange in under 2 seconds. The eastern position erupted in fire and debris. The Taliban advance faltered, fighters diving for cover or simply falling where they stood. The SEALs used the opportunity to shift position, moving to better cover 30 meters south. They were buying time now, seconds that might become minutes if the pilot above them could continue to hold the enemy at bay. But Sloan's options were running out. 220 rounds remaining, one engine on fire, hydraulic pressure at 11% and dropping. The right aileron was now completely unresponsive. She was controlling the aircraft purely through differential thrust and the left side flight controls. It was like trying to fly with one arm tied behind her back while someone actively tried to push her out of the sky. The A-10 shuddered violently as another section of the right engine cowling separated from the airframe. Through her mirrors, Sloan could see pieces of her jet tumbling away into the desert below. The aircraft was coming apart around her. She had maybe 2 more gun runs left before the airframe's structural integrity failed completely. After that, the A-10 would stop being an aircraft and start being a very expensive coffin. She keyed her radio again. "Phantom 2-1, give me your western flank." The SEAL team leader responded immediately. "Western flank, 75 fighters, 300 meters and closing. Revenant, you need to eject. We'll find another way." There was no other way, they both knew it. The nearest artillery support was 40 minutes out. The nearest Apache gunships were 35 minutes away. Rescue birds were 45 minutes minimum. The math was simple and brutal. Without her, the SEALs had maybe 3 minutes left. With her, they might have 10. And 10 minutes might be enough for something to change, for some miracle to materialize out of the Afghan desert. Sloane had never believed in miracles, but she believed in math. And right now, the math said she had 220 rounds and a couple of minutes left to fly. That was enough. It had to be enough. She rolled into her 4th gun run, the one protesting every input. The western flank was the largest concentration of enemy fighters. They had been maneuvering to encircle the SEAL position completely, moving through a series of dried irrigation ditches that provided cover from direct fire. But those ditches offered no protection from a 30 cannon firing from above. Sloane's targeting pipper settled over the lead element. She pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 hammered out 67 rounds. The irrigation ditch became a tomb. But the gun run cost her. The violent recoil from the cannon, combined with the asymmetric thrust from her damaged engines, nearly sent the A-10 into an uncontrolled roll. Sloane fought the stick with both hands, every muscle in her arms straining against the forces trying to flip the aircraft inverted. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, the A-10 hung on the edge of departure from controlled flight. Then somehow, impossibly, she recovered. The wings leveled. The nose came up. She was still flying, still fighting. 153 rounds remaining. The fire in her right engine had now spread to the right wing root. She could see flames licking at the titanium armor that surrounded her cockpit. The heat was intense enough that she could feel it through her flight suit, through the layers of Nomex and Kevlar that were supposed to protect her from exactly this scenario. The master caution panel had gone beyond alarming and entered the realm of absurd. There were so many warnings screaming for her attention that they had become meaningless white noise. She ignored all of them. Her entire world had contracted to 3 things: the targeting pod display, the weapons control panel, and the stick in her hands. Everything else was irrelevant. On the ground, the SEALs had stopped talking. They worked in the silent communion that came from years of operating together, each man understanding his role without needing to speak it aloud. But even in that silence, they were all tracking the same thing. The burning A-10 above them, circling like a wounded angel, refusing to leave. The SEAL team leader had been in combat for most of his adult life. He had called in countless close air support missions. He had worked with Air Force, Marine Corps, and Army pilots from every platform imaginable. He had seen bravery that defied description and sacrifice that humbled him, but he had never seen anything like this. The pilot above him should be dead. By every metric that mattered, that A-10 should have impacted the desert floor 3 minutes ago. Instead, it was still engaging, still putting rounds on target with surgical precision while literally burning out of the sky. He keyed his radio one more time. "Revenant, Phantom 2-1, we are forever in your debt. Please eject." The response came back after a pause that felt eternal. "Phantom, Revenant, I've got 150 rounds left. Let's make them count." There was something in her voice, not resignation, not acceptance, something harder than that. Something that had been forged in places where soft things couldn't survive. Sloane rolled into her fifth gun run. The southern flank this time. The Taliban fighters there had watched 4 of their positions get erased in less than 6 minutes. Some were beginning to retreat. Others, the true believers or the ones with nowhere else to go, continued their advance. He targeted the ones still advancing. The GAU-8 fired 49 rounds. The southern advance collapsed, 104 rounds remaining. The A-10's right wing was now trailing flames like a comet. The hydraulic system had failed completely. She was flying purely on manual reversion, steel cables and pilot strength replacing hydraulic power. Every control input required force that left her arms shaking. The stick felt like it weighed 50 pounds, but she kept flying, kept fighting. The Taliban forces, seeing their positions systematically destroyed, began to break. It started with the western flank, fighters abandoning their weapons and running for the distant tree line. Then the eastern elements began to retreat. Within 90 seconds, the entire assault had collapsed. The SEALs were no longer surrounded. They were alone in a crater-marked landscape filled with smoke and silence. Sloane pulled the A-10 into a climbing left turn, surveying the battlefield one final time through her targeting pod. The enemy forces were scattered, routed. The SEALs were secure. Mission accomplished. Now came the hard part. She had to fly a burning, hydraulically failed A-10 60 nautical miles back to Kandahar airfield. The right engine was completely consumed by fire now. She had already secured it, shut down the fuel and attempted to activate the fire suppression system. The fire suppression system predictably had failed. The flames continued to burn, consuming more of her aircraft with each passing second. She ran through her emergency procedures from memory. Single-engine flight, hydraulic failure, in-flight fire, each checklist ending with the same recommendation, eject. She ignored them all. The A-10 could fly on one engine. She had done it in training. The manual reversion system could get her home. She had practiced that scenario dozens of times. The fire was contained, or at least not spreading fast enough to prevent her from attempting a landing. Probably. She keyed her radio, switching to Kandahar Tower frequency. Kandahar Tower, Revenant 2-1 declaring emergency. Single engine hydraulic failure in flight fire. Request straighten approach runway 23. The controller's response was immediate and professional, but she could hear the tension in his voice. Revenant 2-1, Kandahar Tower, roger your emergency. Runway 23 cleared to land, emergency equipment standing by. Souls on board. 1. Copy 1 soul. Revenant, what is your fuel state? Sloane glanced at her fuel gauge. It was reading 700 pounds. Probably inaccurate given the damage to her aircraft, but it was the only number she had. 700 pounds. There was a pause. Then, Revenant, advise you have approximately 9 minutes of fuel remaining. 9 minutes. Kandahar was 15 minutes away at her current speed. The math, once again, was simple and brutal. She needed to go faster, but going faster would consume her remaining fuel even more quickly. It was a calculus problem with no good solution. She advanced the throttle on her remaining engine, coaxing every knot of airspeed she could from the dying jet. The airspeed indicator climbed to 280 knots. The fuel gauge began dropping faster. Behind her, the flames from her right engine grew brighter, fed by the increased airflow. Sloane focused on the horizon. Kandahar Airfield was out there somewhere, hidden in the morning haze. She just had to stay airborne long enough to find it. The next 8 minutes became a meditation on survival. Every second the A-10 remained in the air was a minor miracle. Every mile closer to Kandahar was a victory. The aircraft shook and groaned around her. Pieces continued to separate from the right wing. The fire spread to consume the entire right side of the fuselage, but the left engine kept running. The manual reversion system kept responding, and Sloane kept flying. At 6 minutes, she had visual contact with Kandahar. At 7 minutes, she was on final approach. At 8 minutes, she was 50 feet above the runway, the A-10 barely under control. The landing was less of a controlled descent and more of a barely managed crash. The A-10 hit the runway hard, the left main gear taking the full weight of the aircraft as the damaged right gear collapsed on impact. Sparks exploded from the right side as metal scraped across concrete. Sloane fought to keep the jet on the center line, her hands locked on the stick with every ounce of strength she had left. The A-10 slewed right, threatening to depart the runway. She stomped on the left rudder pedal, the manual brake system barely responding. The jet continued sliding, spinning, burning. Then somehow it stopped. The A-10 sat in the middle of runway 23, flames pouring from its right side, the right wing collapsed, the fuselage torn and bleeding hydraulic fluid. But it was on the ground, and Sloane was alive. The fire crews were on her aircraft in seconds, foam and water attacking the flames. Sloane went through her shutdown procedures with mechanical precision, her hands moving through the familiar patterns even as they shook. Throttle to cutoff, battery off, master arm safe. When she finally unstrapped from her ejection seat and climbed out of the cockpit, her legs nearly gave out. An Air Force pararescue jumper caught her before she fell. She looked back at her aircraft. The looked like it had been through a war. Because it had. 3 hours later, Sloane sat in the squadron ready room at Kandahar, a mug of terrible coffee growing cold in her hands. She had been through the initial debrief, had been checked by the flight surgeon, had been told that she would be grounded pending the accident investigation. Standard procedure after an incident this severe. The squadron commander, a lieutenant colonel with 3,200 hours in the A-10, sat across from her. He had said very little during the debrief. Had just listened as she walked through every decision, every gun run, every second of that final flight back to base. Now in the quiet of the ready room he finally spoke. The SEALs called. All 12 walked out of that riverbed, not a single casualty. Sloane nodded. She already knew. The SEAL team leader had found her in the medical tent, had tried to say something, had ended up just gripping her hand for 30 seconds before walking away. Some things didn't have words. The squadron commander continued. Command wants to put you in for the Air Force Cross. The Air Force Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor. Sloane felt nothing at the news. No pride, no satisfaction, just a vast, hollow exhaustion that made everything feel distant and unreal. Her father would be proud. That thought came unbidden, unwanted. Her father, who had flown combat missions over Iraq, who had 2 distinguished flying crosses and a Silver Star, who had never quite understood why his daughter had chosen the A-10 instead of following him into fighters, who had died 3 years ago without ever saying he was proud of her choices. Sloane set down her coffee mug. When can I fly again? The squadron commander studied her for a long moment. The flight surgeon wants you off the schedule for at least a week. Psych eval before you're cleared to return to combat operations. I'm fine. You flew a burning jet for 8 minutes with no hydraulics and 1 engine. You're a lot of things right now. Fine isn't one of them. Sloane wanted to argue, wanted to point out that she had followed every procedure, made every correct decision, brought herself and her aircraft home. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just sat there, staring at her hands. The squadron commander stood. Take the week, rest, process what happened. Then we'll get you back in the seat. He paused at the door. That was the finest display of airmanship I've seen in 26 years of flying. Your father would have been proud. After he left, Sloane sat alone in the ready room for another hour. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Kandahar, another day beginning in the endless war. Somewhere in the maintenance hangar, her A-10 was being catalogued and assessed. The preliminary report suggested the aircraft might be repairable, though it would take months and extensive work. The jet had absorbed incredible damage. 23 significant hits from small arms fire. 1 MANPADS strike. Multiple structural failures. Hydraulic system completely destroyed. Right engine burnt beyond recovery, but it had kept flying, had kept fighting, had brought its pilot home. That, Sloane thought, was the real story. Not her decisions, not her airmanship, but the aircraft itself. The ugly, ungainly, that everyone said was obsolete, that the Pentagon kept trying to retire, that the pilots who flew it loved with an intensity that bordered on irrational. The jet had done what it was designed to do. It had protected its pilot while the pilot protected the troops on the ground. 7 months later, Sloan stood on a stage at Nellis Air Force Base, the pale blue ribbon of the Air Force Cross around her neck. The ceremony was attended by senior officers, her squadron mates, and a group of 12 Navy SEALs who had flown in from Virginia specifically to be there. The citation was read aloud. The words described her actions over Helmand Province in clinical military language, engaged enemy forces while under direct fire, continued mission despite catastrophic aircraft damage, saved 12 personnel from imminent enemy contact. The words captured the facts but missed the truth. The truth was harder to articulate. It lived in the space between deciding to eject and deciding to stay. Between what you were supposed to do and what you actually did when the choice was in front of you. Between the pilot you were trained to be and the pilot you became when everything went wrong. After the ceremony, the SEAL team leader found her. Master Chief Marcus Kowalski, 17 years in naval special warfare, Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars, a man who had seen every form of courage the human spirit could manifest. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her watching the crowd disperse. Then quietly, "My daughter wants to fly, she's 14, asks me about it constantly." Sloan glanced at him. "What do you tell her?" "I told her about you, about what you did for us." He was quiet for a moment. She asked if women could really do that, be combat pilots, fly in combat. I told her about the A-10 that refused to leave, about the pilot who kept coming back even when her jet was on fire, about how 12 of us went home because one person decided we were worth dying for. His voice caught slightly. I told her that courage doesn't have a gender, that the best pilot I ever worked with happened to be a woman, and that if she wanted to fly, she should fly like Revenant. They stood together in silence for a while longer. Then Kowalski extended his hand. "Thank you for our lives, for my daughter's future, for everything." Sloan shook his hand. "Thank you for trusting me to do my job." After he left, Sloan found a quiet corner of the base and called her mother. Her father had been gone for 3 years now. Her mother lived alone in Colorado Springs in the house where Sloan had grown up, surrounded by photographs of her husband in flight suits and fighter cockpits. Her mother answered on the second ring. "I watched the ceremony online. Your father would have been so proud." Sloan closed her eyes. "I know. He loved you so much, he just didn't know how to say it." "I know that too." They talked for a few more minutes. Her mother's voice, familiar and comforting, grounding her in a way that nothing else could. When she finally ended the call, Sloan sat on a bench outside the hangar and stared at the flight line. Rows of A-10s sat in their revetments, the distinctive twin engines and straight wings unmistakable even from a distance. Ugly, brutal, effective machines built for a single purpose: to protect the people on the ground no matter the cost. Her A-10, the one she had flown over Helmand, had been repaired. It had taken 7 months and extensive structural work, but the jet was flying again. Someone else was flying it now. Sloan had been reassigned to a training squadron at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. She would spend the next 2 years teaching new pilots how to fly the Warthog, how to deliver ordnance with precision, how to communicate with ground forces, how to make life-and-death decisions in seconds. She thought about Master Chief Kowalski's daughter, 14 years old, dreaming of flying. Maybe she would end up in Sloan's classroom someday. Maybe she would learn to fly the A-10. Maybe she would find herself over some future battlefield, making the same impossible choices that Sloan had made. The sun was setting over Nellie's, painting the Nevada sky in shades of orange and gold. Sloan stood and walked toward the hangar where her squadron mates were waiting. The Air Force Cross felt heavy around her neck, but not as heavy as the weight she had carried for 7 months. The weight of knowing that 12 men were alive because she had refused to leave. The weight of understanding what that meant, what it would always mean. She had become her call sign that day over Helmand. Revenant, the ghost who wouldn't leave. The pilot who came back, not because she was fearless, but because she understood that some things were more important than fear. Some people were worth dying for. Some fights were worth finishing, even when the smart play was to walk away. That was the real story of that morning in Helmand Province. Not the gun runs or the burning engine or the impossible landing, but the choice she had made over and over in every second of that 47-minute mission. To stay, to fight, to protect the people who couldn't protect themselves. Years later, long after Sloan had left active duty and transitioned to the Air National Guard, a young lieutenant in her training squadron asked her about that day. About the decision to stay over Helmand with her jet on fire. Sloan had thought about the question for a long time. Then she said, "I stayed because leaving wasn't an option, not because I was brave, but because 12 people needed me and I was the only one who could help them." When you strip away all the training and the procedures and the tactical considerations, that's what we do. We help people. And sometimes helping people means accepting costs you wouldn't normally accept. Risks you wouldn't normally take. That's not bravery, that's just the job. The young lieutenant had nodded, trying to understand. Sloan knew she wouldn't, not really. Not until she found herself in a similar situation, facing a similar choice. That was how it always worked. You couldn't teach someone to be brave. You couldn't train someone to sacrifice. You could only put them in the cockpit, give them the tools, and hope they made the right choices when the moment came. The A-10 was being retired. The announcement had come down from the Pentagon 6 months ago. After 47 years of service, the Warthog would finally be put out to pasture. Newer, more advanced aircraft would take its place. Fighters and bombers with stealth technology and precision weapons and capabilities the A-10 could never match. Sloan understood the logic. The military had to evolve, had to adapt to new threats and new battlefields. But part of her mourned the loss. The A-10 had been designed during the Cold War to kill Soviet tanks in Europe. It had ended up becoming the most beloved aircraft in the inventory, not because of its performance specifications, but because of what it represented: protection, presence, the sound of salvation arriving just in time. The troops on the ground loved the A-10 because they knew what that distinctive silhouette meant. It meant someone was watching over them, someone who would stay on station until the job was done, someone who would absorb incredible punishment and keep fighting, someone who would come back. 3 years after her retirement from active duty, Sloan received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy. The topic was leadership under extreme conditions. She had initially declined. She didn't think of herself as a leader. She thought of herself as a pilot who had done her job under difficult circumstances. But they had persisted, and eventually she had agreed. She stood in front of 200 cadets, all of them earnest and young and hungry to prove themselves. She told them about Helmand, about the choice she had made, about the 47 minutes that had defined her career and her life. When she finished, a cadet raised her hand. "Ma'am, what would you have done if you had ejected? If you had followed the emergency procedures and left those SEALs?" Sloan considered the question. "I would have survived. The SEALs would have died. And I would have spent the rest of my life knowing that I chose my safety over their lives." She paused. "That's not a burden I was willing to carry." The cadet nodded slowly. "So you were willing to die for people you had never met?" "Yes." "Why?" Sloan smiled slightly. "Because that's what the uniform means. It means you serve something larger than yourself, larger than your fear or your self-preservation or your desire to go home at the end of the day. It means when someone needs help, you help them, even if it costs you everything." The auditorium was silent. 200 cadets, all of them processing what that meant, what it would mean for them in whatever future they created. Sloan looked out at them and saw her younger self, eager, uncertain, desperate to prove she belonged. She hoped they understood. She hoped they would remember that when their moment came, and it would come, it always did, they would make the right choice. Not the easy choice, not the safe choice, but the right choice. The one that meant someone else got to go home. That night, alone in her hotel room, Sloan dreamed of fire and sky, of an A-10 burning its way across the Afghan desert, of 12 voices on the radio calling for help, of the choice she had made over and over in every second of those 47 minutes. When she woke, the sun was rising over Colorado. The mountains were touched with gold. The sky was clear and infinite. And somewhere on some distant battlefield, another pilot was making another impossible choice. Another warthog was refusing to leave. Another ghost was coming back. The legacy continued. The story endured, and the sky remembered.